Most people who explore ancient writings expect small variations, minor additions, or different wording. But when you step into the Book of Jubilees for the first time, you immediately notice that it does something unusual. It does not simply restate the familiar creation story. It widens the frame and reveals details that feel precise, structured, and intentional. It presents the beginning of the world in a way that makes you realize that the early chapters of Genesis might only be the surface of a much larger narrative. The more you read, the more it feels like this text is trying to restore something that was once known but slowly forgotten over generations. Instead of starting with a single moment, Jubilees begins by explaining that creation involved elements many people never hear about. It describes the formation of time with the same importance as the formation of the earth. It shows that days, seasons, and years were not left to natural development. They were shaped deliberately. Time itself had a structure designed to keep everything in harmony. According to Jubilees, this was not symbolism or poetic style. It was the foundation of how the world was supposed to function. The idea of a structured creation becomes even more interesting when the text explains the purpose of the first day. While Genesis focuses on the introduction of light, Jubilees adds that God created a host of angels before anything else took shape. These angels were not secondary. They were assigned duties connected to the very design of the universe. Some watched over the cycles of nature. Some protected the laws that would later be given to humanity. Others acted as keepers of sacred times and seasons. This early presence of angels gives context to many later stories because it suggests the spiritual world was active and organized from the beginning. Jubilees continues by describing a calendar with 364 days, arranged into 4 equal seasons of 91 days each. This structure kept the year balanced so that the Sabbath and appointed days always stayed on their exact dates. This was not presented as a cultural preference, but as the original calendar established at creation. The text explains that this system reflected order and stability. It made sure the world moved according to the patterns set by God. In this framework, time was not flexible or open to interpretation. It was a direct extension of divine design. But the text quickly reveals a problem. Humanity eventually abandoned this original calendar and began following a lunar system, which caused the appointed days to shift. Celebrations that were once steady began appearing at the wrong times. The alignment between human life and divine order weakened. According to Jubilees, this was not a small mistake. It was a major turning point that contributed to the disorder that spread through the early world. When people disconnected from the structure created on the first day, the harmony that once shaped the rhythm of life began to fade. Before this shift happened, however, the text describes how humanity was originally guided. Adam was not left without knowledge or direction. He received instruction directly from angels who taught him how to live within the structure of creation. They explained the laws of purity, the meaning of the Sabbath, the purpose of marriage, and the foundation of sacrifice. Adam learned not through trial and error, but through direct teaching from beings who understood the order they were created to protect. This teaching formed the base of early human life. This detail changes how we understand the earliest generations. Jubilees presents them not as primitive or uninformed, but as people who inherited clear instruction. Adam passed the laws to his children, and his children passed them to theirs. According to this text, the laws later revealed to Moses were not new. They were ancient laws known since the beginning. They were part of creation itself. This continuity between the earliest humans and the later covenant helps explain why obedience and disobedience carry such strong meaning throughout the rest of the story. This background also affects how we view the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis, the conflict appears simple. Cain reacts with resentment toward Abel. In Jubilees, the event is tied to the deeper issue of alignment with the laws given to Adam. Abel's offering followed the original instructions. Cain's offering did not. When Cain acted against Abel, he stepped outside the structure that defined harmony and order. This was not only a personal act, it was a disruption of the divine instruction that had existed from the first generation. Jubilees uses this moment to show how easily the balance of creation could be broken when people rejected the guidance given to them. As the story continues, Jubilees begins connecting these early choices to the direction the world takes as generations pass. The text makes it clear that what happens later, especially the events leading to the flood, cannot be understood without this foundation. The world was built with structure, laws, and intentional order. When humanity ignored that foundation, the consequences were not random. They were a direct result of losing the balance established at creation. This opening prepares the reader for everything that comes next. It explains why the world shifts the way it does. It explains why some individuals like Noah stand out so clearly. It explains why certain laws appear so early in the narrative and why the relationship between the heavens and the earth plays such a central role. By the time the story transitions from Adam to the early generations, the reader understands that creation was not only an event, it was a system, and every part of that system mattered. As we move forward, this understanding will make the progression from Adam to the rise of corruption, the influence of the fallen angels, and the appearance of Noah much clearer. The next chapter of this journey will reveal how the world changed, how the first generations responded to the teachings they received, and how the divine order began to break under the weight of choices that moved further and further away from the original design. If you want to keep following this journey, write in the comments whether you believe humanity today has moved too far from the structure the ancient texts describe, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this unfolding narrative. When you finish reading the opening chapters of Jubilees, you may feel that the beginning of the world was more structured than you ever imagined. But the moment the text shifts from creation to the earliest lives, the story changes shape again. It becomes more intimate, more focused, and more aware of how every decision made by the first generations leaves a mark on the future. Instead of presenting history as a list of events, Jubilees describes a world still close to its original order, where every action carries weight because nothing has been buried under centuries of human experience. The early world is clear, unfiltered, and surprisingly direct. This is where the story moves from structure to people, and everything becomes more personal. The first minutes of this transition already reveal that the early generations faced choices much greater than what most people today assume. The text begins by showing that Adam, after receiving instruction from the angels, did not keep this knowledge for himself. He passed it to his children with the same clarity he had been given. This is important because it means humanity started with understanding rather than confusion. The laws of purity, the meaning of the Sabbath, the foundation of sacrifice, and the principles of marriage were taught in a world that had not yet drifted from the original design. This makes the early environment feel calm but fragile. Calm because everything was still new. Fragile because every deviation could cause consequences that would echo for generations. Jubilees wants you to notice this tension early, because the story that follows depends on it. One of the first signs of this tension appears in the story of Adam's sons. Genesis gives a simple description, but Jubilees slows the moment down, making the contrast between Cain and Abel clearer. Abel follows the instruction he received. Cain does not. Jubilees does not describe Cain as someone acting in ignorance. He knew the teachings. He understood the structure. But he chose differently. This choice becomes the first moment in which humanity steps outside the order of creation, and the effects of this decision move across the generations. The act against Abel was not a random expression of anger. It was a break from the laws Adam had been given, the same laws the angels taught on the first day of human history. The story then shifts to Seth, who becomes the link between the pure instruction of Adam and the generations that follow. Jubilees emphasizes that Seth is not simply a replacement for Abel. He represents the restoration of the divine teaching in a world that has just seen its first major act of rejection. Seth continues the line of obedience, and through him, the knowledge of the original laws moves forward. This detail is often overlooked, but in Jubilees it becomes essential. Without Seth, the structure established in creation would have disappeared almost immediately. The story then begins to stretch across generations. Jubilees describes how the descendants of Adam spread through the earth. At first, the world still carries the clarity of the beginning. The laws are known, the instructions remain, but slowly, over time, the influence of the original teaching begins to fade. People begin living without connection to the structure they once understood. This creates the setting for the next major shift in the story, one that brings a dramatic change to the early world. This change centers on the arrival of the fallen angels and the rise of the Nephilim. Genesis mentions this briefly, but Jubilees takes time to explain why this moment is so important. The fallen angels did not simply appear to cause chaos. They brought knowledge that was never meant for humanity. They taught skills and practices that disrupted the balance of the early earth. They shaped cultures that were disconnected from the order God had created. Their offspring, the Nephilim, brought violence that humans had never seen. The harmony that once defined the world began to break, not only in actions, but in the structure that supported life itself. Jubilees presents this period as the beginning of a complete breakdown in the relationship between humanity and the laws of creation. People abandoned the original calendar. They ignored the instructions Adam had received. They accepted the influence of beings who were never meant to guide. And then, the earth became filled with corruption, not only in behavior, but in the understanding of time, purity, and worship. The world that once reflected harmony now reflected confusion. And the more humanity learned from the fallen angels, the further they moved from the design given at the beginning. It is in this environment that Noah enters the story. Jubilees describes him in a way that makes him stand out immediately. Instead of being shaped by the new influences that had spread across the earth, Noah remained connected to the ancient teachings. He followed the Sabbath. He honored the laws of purity. He kept the structure of sacrifice that had been passed down from Adam. He lived according to the order that had been established before the world changed. This made him different from the generations around him. Noah did not simply behave better. He aligned himself with a structure that most people had already abandoned. This connection is the reason he becomes the one chosen to survive the flood. Jubilees explains that the flood was not only a judgment on violence, it was a restoration of the original order. The world had drifted so far from its design that it could no longer continue in its current state. The flood acted as a reset, bringing creation back to the balance it had lost. Noah's survival becomes symbolic because he carries the original teachings through the destruction. He becomes the bridge between the old world and the new one. After the flood, Jubilees spends time describing the renewed covenant God gives to Noah. This covenant includes the same laws of purity, the same instructions regarding the Sabbath, and the same guidance for sacrifice that had existed since Adam. The flood does not create new laws, it reaffirms the ancient ones. This Detail is important because it shows that the structure of creation does not change. Humanity may forget it, but the design remains the same. Noah is expected to preserve this knowledge and pass it to his sons, just as Adam passed it to his children before him. The text makes it clear that this moment marks the beginning of a new era. The world after the flood is given another opportunity to follow the order it lost. Noah teaches his sons the instructions he received, and for a time, the world begins to stabilize again. But Jubilees hints that this stability will not last indefinitely. Just as the generations before the flood drifted away from the original design, the generations after the flood will also face challenges that push them off course. This sets the stage for the appearance of figures like Abraham, who will become central in the restoration of the ancient structure. All of these details make the early chapters of Jubilees feel connected and intentional. The text explains why the world changed, why the flood was necessary, and why certain individuals became so important in the biblical story. It shows that nothing happened without a cause. The world moved between harmony and disorder based on humanity's connection to the original laws established at creation. The next part of this journey will follow the generations after Noah, the rise of new cultures, and the moment Abraham appears in history as someone who rediscovers what the world had forgotten. If you want to continue exploring this hidden narrative, write in the comments whether you believe the early world was more advanced in understanding than we assume today, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of this unfolding story. The world that emerged after the flood carried a strange mixture of clarity and uncertainty. On one hand, humanity had been given a fresh beginning, guided again by the covenant Noah received and the ancient laws that had survived from the earliest days. On the other hand, the world had changed. The memories of the old world still rested inside the stories of the families who lived through it, but the dangers that once existed had not been completely erased. The descendants of Noah grew into new communities, spread across different regions, and formed cultures that developed unique ideas, habits, and beliefs. For a short time, everything seemed stable, yet under the surface, the same pattern that shaped the world before the flood slowly began to reappear. Knowledge drifted, influence shifted. People started seeking independence from the structure that had been given at creation. As generations passed, Jubilees describes how this slow drift created conditions that were different from Noah's time, but rooted in the same problem. Some families preserved the ancient teachings with care, others grew distant from them, and some turned toward practices that had no connection to the laws Noah had taught. The flood had reset the world, but it had not removed human choice. This period becomes the bridge between the world of Noah and the rise of one of the most important figures in biblical history, Abraham. Long before he becomes a patriarch, he begins life in a world where the original structure still exists, yet many around him do not follow it. Jubilees does something unusual here. Instead of starting Abraham's story when he receives the divine call, it goes back to his childhood. It describes a young boy growing up in a household that does not follow the ancient faith. His father, Terah, participates in traditions that have nothing to do with the laws Noah taught. The household is filled with idols, rituals, and practices that feel disconnected from the structure of creation. Abraham sees this from an early age, and the text shows how he becomes aware that something is wrong long before he receives any direct instruction from God. Jubilees emphasizes this internal awareness, making it clear that Abraham's journey begins long before he hears a command to leave his homeland. In this early stage of his life, Abraham starts asking questions that the people around him do not know how to answer. He looks at the idols made by human hands and wonders how objects with no life could guide anyone. He watches the practices of his community and recognizes that they do not reflect the order he senses in the world. Jubilees describes a moment where this quiet doubt grows into certainty. Abraham realizes that the teachings passed through his family are not connected to the ancient laws given at creation. This realization becomes the turning point that shifts the direction of his entire life. Instead of accepting the traditions of his environment, he begins searching for the truth that had been preserved by Noah's line. The text makes it clear that Abraham's search is not based on rebellion. It is based on recognition. He understands that the world around him is drifting from the structure established at the beginning. This sense pushes him toward a deeper awareness. And Jubilees shows that divine guidance begins to intervene at this moment. Angels start influencing Abraham's thoughts, leading him to understand the laws that had been given to Adam, preserved through Seth, restored by Noah, and passed into the generations that followed. These teachings are not new to the world, but they are new to Abraham because his household had lost them. This is where the story becomes more mystical. Jubilees describes how Abraham begins to understand the Sabbath, the laws of purity, and the meaning of sacrifice, even before God speaks to him directly. These teachings come through quiet guidance from the angels assigned to preserve the divine order. Even though Abraham has never met them physically, their influence awakens memories of the original structure that the world once followed. He becomes aware of the difference between the ancient path and the new practices that have taken root among the people. This awareness builds inside him, forming the center of his identity long before he receives his first command from God. One of the most dramatic moments in this early stage happens when Abraham confronts the idols in his father's house. Jubilees portrays this moment with unusual clarity. Abraham examines the idols one by one, recognizing that they have no power, no understanding, and no connection to the divine structure. His rejection of these objects is not emotional, it is logical. He sees that the world was created with order and intention, and these idols do not fit into that design. The text describes how he destroys them, not out of anger, but out of conviction that the world was meant to follow a different path. This act does not make him a leader yet, but it marks him as someone who refuses to submit to a broken system. After this turning point, Jubilees reveals how Abraham's understanding grows rapidly. He begins practicing the laws that had existed before the flood. He observes the Sabbath. He respects the laws of purity. He performs sacrifices according to the original instructions. He begins aligning himself with the structure that had been established at creation, long before his generation lost sight of it. This alignment, not his age or status, is the reason he becomes a central figure in the unfolding story. When God finally speaks to him and tells him to leave his homeland, Abraham is already prepared. His heart is aligned with the original order, and his mind recognizes the difference between truth and distortion. Jubilees explains that when Abraham begins his journey toward the land of Canaan, he is not simply obeying a command. He is leaving behind a world shaped by practices that had no connection to the ancient laws. He is stepping toward a place where the divine plan will unfold again. His journey becomes a symbol of restoration. Through him, the structure that had been lost in the generations after Noah will be renewed. This is why the text spends so much time describing his early years. Abraham's life did not begin with a command. It began with a search for the truth that had existed long before him. As the narrative continues, Abraham becomes the one chosen to carry the covenant forward. Jubilees explains that he receives teachings from angels, just as Adam did. These teachings are not symbolic. They are practical. They include instructions for sacrifice, purity, the Sabbath, and the laws that will form the foundation of the covenant with Israel. Abraham becomes a link between the ancient world and the future nation that will descend from him. He does not introduce new laws. He restores the ones that had existed since creation. This restoration becomes the center of his life. When Abraham receives the covenant of circumcision, Jubilees explains that this instruction was not created in his time. It was part of the original order written on the heavenly tablets. Abraham becomes the human expression of a structure that has existed since the beginning. This is why his story is not only about faith, it is about alignment. He lives according to the same laws that guided Adam, the same laws Noah preserved, and the same laws that will later be given to Moses. Everything becomes connected. As this part of the story closes, the world around Abraham begins to shift. New nations rise, old practices return. The influence of the fallen angels still lingers in some cultures. But in the middle of this world, filled with competing beliefs, Abraham stands as a singular figure who remembers what the world was designed to follow. His life becomes the center of the next part of the narrative, where the covenant expands, challenges appear, and the next generations take on the responsibility of carrying the structure forward. If you want to continue this journey, write in the comments whether you believe Abraham's early awakening was guided by divine influence or personal conviction, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of this unfolding story. After following Abraham through the early moments of his transformation, the story in Jubilees begins to shift again. It moves from an individual awakening into a larger path that will shape entire nations. The world around Abraham is filled with movement. Kingdoms rise, families expand, new cultures form their own customs. Yet within this growing world, the covenant becomes the thread that connects Abraham's personal journey to the future of the people who will come from him. Jubilees makes it clear that what began as one man searching for the original order of creation becomes the foundation through which that order will be preserved for generations. This transition is where the story becomes even more complex and layered, especially as the focus turns to Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau. The text presents Isaac not as a quiet figure in the shadow of his father, but as someone who carries the covenant with purpose. Throughout his life, Isaac follows the same structure Abraham restored. He observes the Sabbath. He honors the laws of purity. He teaches the order of creation to his household, just as Abraham did before him. Jubilees emphasizes that Isaac does not treat these teachings as traditions. He treats them as part of the design of the world, something that must be respected and protected. His life becomes a continuation of the restoration Abraham began, not an imitation of it. Rebekah enters this part of the story with a level of understanding that the text highlights in several moments. She recognizes the importance of the covenant and the seriousness of preserving the structure God established. Jubilees explains that Rebekah receives insight about the future of her children even before they are born. She learns that the two children in her womb will walk very different paths. One will align with the covenant, the other will not. This early revelation sets the stage for one of the most significant family stories in biblical history, the story of Jacob and Esau. When Jacob and Esau are born, the differences between them are not just about personality. Jubilees shows that their lives represent two directions humanity can take. Esau grows in strength, skill, and independence, but he becomes uninterested in the laws that guided his ancestors. He does not value the birthright because he does not understand its spiritual meaning. The text describes his choices with clarity. Esau marries women from surrounding nations who do not follow the ancient laws. He adopts customs that have no connection to the original teachings, and he moves further from the covenant with each decision he makes. Jubilees portrays him not as an evil figure, but as someone who walks away from the structure that began at creation. Jacob's life moves in the opposite direction. From a young age, he becomes drawn to the teachings that Isaac and Rebekah preserve. He learns the laws Abraham restored. He follows the same order that guided Noah, Seth, and Adam. Jubilees explains that angels assist Jacob in understanding the deeper meaning of these teachings. He becomes the next individual chosen to carry the covenant, not because of preference, but because of alignment. He seeks the structure God established, and his desire to live within it becomes the reason he receives the blessing. The moment Jacob receives the blessing from Isaac is described in Jubilees with great detail. It is not presented as a moment shaped by deception or trickery. Instead, the text frames it as the fulfillment of the revelation Rebekah received during her pregnancy. Jacob is chosen because he follows the ancient order. The blessing does not create his destiny, it confirms it. This moment shifts the path of the story, setting Jacob apart as the one who will continue the covenant and pass it to the next generation. Esau's response in Jubilees is written with more depth than in many other sources. He feels the weight of what he lost, but he does not understand why it mattered. His frustration grows into resentment, and his choices begin shaping more than his own life. Jubilees explains that Esau's descendants will grow into a nation that continually opposes Jacob's line. This tension does not begin in conflict alone. It begins in direction. Jacob moves toward the covenant. Esau moves away from it. Their descendants follow the same pattern, and this pattern becomes part of the story that continues throughout Scripture. Jubilees then takes time to describe Jacob's journey in detail. After receiving the blessing, Jacob does not simply step into greatness. He experiences challenges, uncertainty, and long periods of reflection. Yet even in these moments, the text explains that angels appear to guide him. They teach him the deeper commandments. They remind him of the structure of creation. They strengthen him when he feels alone. These encounters shape Jacob into the person who will eventually receive the name Israel, a name that becomes a symbol of the covenant itself. During this time, something mystical happens that Jubilees highlights with clear intention. Jacob's understanding of the ancient laws deepens, not through simple learning, but through direct revelation. The text describes moments when Jacob receives instructions that were written on the heavenly tablets. These instructions are not new. They existed before the world was formed, and Jacob becomes the next human to receive them. This connection between Jacob and the original structure becomes one of the most important elements of his story. It prepares him for the future that awaits him and the role his children will play. Jacob's family becomes the next turning point in the narrative. Jubilees explains that the birth of each of his sons is not random. The timing of each birth aligns with the structure of the calendar established at creation. Each child carries a purpose connected to the covenant. This detail gives the 12 sons of Jacob a sense of identity that goes beyond their personalities. They represent the foundation of a nation that will preserve the laws of creation. Their lives become the next chapter in the unfolding story, connecting the ancient world to the future. Esau, meanwhile, continues forming his own household, separate from the covenant. Jubilees describes how his descendants become aligned with nations that follow different customs, different laws, and different rhythms. This creates a contrast between the line of Jacob and the line of Esau. One line preserves the ancient structure, the other does not. This difference shapes the relationship between the two families for generations. The tension between the two brothers becomes symbolic. It represents how humanity continually chooses between alignment and separation. Jubilees treats this tension as part of the larger story, showing that each decision made by Jacob and Esau becomes the beginning of patterns that will appear again and again in the generations that follow. This theme becomes important as the text prepares to transition toward the next major figure in the narrative, Joseph. Jacob's household grows, and the covenant becomes stronger through the teachings he passes to his children, but the world around them begins to change again. New influences rise, new challenges appear. The nation that will one day become Israel is still in its earliest form, and many events are still ahead. The next chapters of this journey will reveal how the covenant survives through conflict, struggle, and unexpected turns, especially through the life of Joseph. If you want to keep following this journey, write in the comments whether you believe Joseph's role in the story was shaped long before his birth, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The moment the story turns toward Joseph, the entire atmosphere of Jubilees begins to shift. Up to this point, the covenant has moved through individuals, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, each one receiving the teachings that existed before the world changed. But with Joseph, the narrative enters a world shaped by nations, rulers, and systems larger than any single family. This is where the covenant is tested in a new environment, one far removed from the familiar land of Jacob. Joseph's life becomes more than a family story. It becomes the bridge between the ancient structure of creation and the rising world powers that will eventually influence the future of Israel. This transition marks the beginning of a new chapter in the hidden history of the early world. Jubilees begins Joseph's story with a clear understanding of who he is within the covenant. From a young age, he is presented as someone whose character reflects the same alignment that defined the earlier patriarchs. He values purity, he listens to instruction, he recognizes the order that shaped his ancestors. This makes him stand out within Jacob's household, which is now filled with complexity, 12 sons, and growing tension. Joseph does not act with arrogance or superiority. He simply follows the structure he knows to be true, and this creates feelings among his brothers that the text describes with careful detail. The conflict within the family is not only emotional. Jubilees explains that the brothers' frustration with Joseph becomes a spiritual turning point. Their impatience and jealousy push them away from the ancient teachings, leading them to actions that echo the same patterns seen in earlier generations, moving away from the order they were supposed to protect. The decision to sell Joseph is described as a serious act, one that is recorded on the heavenly tablets. This is not presented as a simple mistake. It has long-term consequences, not only for the family, but for the destiny of the people who will one day become the nation of Israel. When Joseph is sold into slavery, the narrative could easily shift into despair. But Jubilees presents this moment with clarity and purpose. It explains that God does not allow Joseph to fall into the hands of those who would destroy him. Instead, angels accompany him, ensuring that the path he takes leads him to Egypt. The text highlights that Joseph's life had been written into the structure of the world long before his brothers made their decision. His journey into Egypt is not driven by chance. It follows a plan that aligns with the covenant, prepared for a future that Jacob's family does not yet understand. Once Joseph arrives in Egypt, the environment around him changes completely. He is surrounded by new customs, new languages, and a culture far from the teachings of his ancestors. Yet Jubilees emphasizes that Joseph does not let these influences separate him from the covenant. Even in a foreign land, he maintains purity, honors the laws he was taught, and lives according to the structure that guided his family. This separation between Joseph and his surroundings becomes one of the reasons he rises in influence. He carries a clarity that the people of Egypt recognize, even if they cannot explain it. Jubilees describes how God grants Joseph wisdom, insight, and understanding that set him apart. When he interprets dreams for the officials of Pharaoh and later for Pharaoh himself, the text explains that this ability is not simply a talent. It is part of the design written in the heavenly tablets. Joseph becomes the person who will preserve life during a coming famine and who will bring Jacob's family into Egypt at the exact time chosen in the divine plan. His rise to power is not accidental. It is connected to the ancient structure that shaped the creation of the world. As Joseph becomes second in command in Egypt, Jubilees focuses on his character. Despite holding a position of authority, he does not compromise the laws of purity. He does not adopt the customs that conflict with the covenant. He remains consistent, and this consistency becomes the reason his life shapes the next era of biblical history. When the famine reaches the land of Canaan and Jacob sends his sons to Egypt, the story returns to the conflict that began many years earlier. Jubilees explains that Joseph sees his brothers with a level of understanding deeper than what is written in the traditional text. He recognizes that their actions had consequences, but he also sees the covenant moving in a direction that will preserve the future. The reunion between Joseph and his brothers is described with a balance of justice and restoration. Joseph tests them not to harm them, but to reveal whether they have changed. Jubilee shows that Joseph wants to know if they understand the weight of their decisions and whether they are ready to align themselves again with the structure of creation. When he finally reveals himself, the moment becomes more than emotional. It becomes symbolic. The covenant that had been fractured through jealousy is restored through forgiveness. Joseph urges his family to settle in Egypt because he understands the larger plan. Jubilees explains that Joseph knows their time in Egypt will not be permanent. He knows they will one day be enslaved. He knows they will one day be delivered. He understands that the covenant includes both struggle and restoration. This knowledge does not make him passive, it strengthens him. He becomes the guide who brings his family into a land where the next phase of God's plan will begin. Jacob's arrival in Egypt becomes a powerful moment in the narrative. Jubilees explains that when Jacob enters the land, the divine plan for Israel becomes clearer. The family begins to grow into a nation. The covenant moves with them. The teachings are preserved, yet the text also warns that a shift will soon come. A new Pharaoh will rise who does not remember Joseph. The protection Joseph provided will fade, and the nation will face a period of suffering that had already been written into the structure long before the first brick of Egypt was laid. Joseph's final years are described with a sense of purpose. He continues guiding his family. He preserves the ancient laws. He prepares them for what will come after his death. Jubilees explains that before Joseph dies, he reminds his people of the covenant, the laws of purity, the Sabbath, and the promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He tells them that God will one day visit them, free them, and bring them back to the land promised to their ancestors. His final message becomes a seed planted in the heart of Israel, a seed that will grow in the darkest moments of their future. Joseph's death marks the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. His life creates the foundation for the era of Moses, the Exodus, and the revealing of the law on Mount Sinai. Jubilees makes it clear that every event leading to this moment is connected. The structure that shaped creation continues guiding the story. The covenant remains the center. The laws remain active. And the destiny of Israel moves forward into a period of struggle, revelation, and transformation. If you want to continue this journey, write in the comments whether you believe Joseph understood the full future of Israel before he died, and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of this unfolding story. By the time the story reaches the final stage of Jubilees, the world of Joseph has faded into memory, and a new atmosphere surrounds the descendants of Israel. What once felt stable now feels fragile. What once seemed certain becomes uncertain. The family that entered Egypt under Joseph's protection has now grown into a nation, but their growing numbers draw attention, fear, and eventually hostility. This shift does not begin with open conflict. It begins quietly, through changes in leadership, changes in priorities, and changes in the way the Egyptians view the people living among them. Jubilees describes this transition carefully because it marks the moment when the covenant prepares to move into its next phase. A new Pharaoh rises, one who knows nothing about Joseph or the role he played in saving Egypt from famine. Without that memory, the status of Israel changes almost overnight. The favor Joseph earned stops protecting them. Their identity as a nation becomes more noticeable, and soon fear takes root in the heart of Egypt's rulers. Jubilees explains that this fear grows into oppression. Israel is forced into heavy labor, their freedom slowly disappearing as the Egyptians attempt to control their growth. But the text also makes it clear that this oppression did not surprise God. It had been written long before, part of a larger plan that would lead to the next revelation. As the suffering increases, the people of Israel begin to remember the words Joseph spoke before his death. He told them that God would one day visit them, free them, and bring them to the land promised to their ancestors. This promise becomes the source of strength in a time when everything else feels hopeless. Jubilees uses this moment to show that the covenant does not disappear in hardship. It becomes more visible. When the oppression is at its highest, the covenant becomes the center of their identity, reminding them that their story is not ending. It is preparing for transformation. Jubilees explains that the suffering of Israel is not only political, it is spiritual. Forces that oppose the covenant influence the hearts of the Egyptians, pushing them to act with increasing severity. Yet the text shows that angels stand among the people during this time, watching, guiding, and waiting for the appointed moment when the next stage of the divine plan will begin. The rise of Moses is not a sudden miracle. It is the result of generations preparing, waiting, and holding to the promise spoken long before. When Moses appears, the story takes on a new sense of direction. Jubilees emphasizes that Moses does not bring a new law. He brings a revelation of what has existed since the creation of the world. At Mount Sinai, the laws written on the heavenly tablets, the same laws given to Adam, preserved by Seth, renewed through Noah, restored by Abraham, honored by Isaac, followed by Jacob, and carried through Joseph, are revealed in full. The text explains that this moment does not introduce something unfamiliar. It restores a structure that humanity lost again and again. The angels now play an even greater role. Jubilees describes them assisting in the giving of the law, ensuring that every command is communicated clearly. They reveal the purpose of the Sabbath, the meaning of purity, the reason for the festivals, and the structure of the sacred calendar. The people of Israel receive not only instructions, but a complete framework that organizes life according to the order established at the beginning of creation. This is why the giving of the law in Jubilees feels so different from many traditional interpretations. It is not the start of something new. It is the return to the original design. The text then moves forward, showing how Israel's future is shaped by this moment. The covenant is expanded, recorded, and sealed. But Jubilees does not end with commandments alone. It moves beyond history and enters a prophetic vision. It describes the path Israel will take after Moses, their struggles, their moments of disobedience, their exiles, their return, and their restoration. The book explains that nothing in their journey will be random. Every rise and fall will follow the structure written in the heavenly tablets. Time itself continues to unfold according to this ancient design. One of the most striking elements in this final section is the role of the angels in the future of the world. Jubilees explains that they will act as guides, protectors, and judges during the final stages of history. They will separate those who follow the covenant from those who reject it. They will restrain the forces that oppose the divine plan. They will prepare creation for the moment when justice arrives. Jubilees speaks of a time when the power of evil will be removed completely, when the order of creation will be restored, and when the covenant will be fulfilled in its fullness. This leads into the final vision, a restored world where the original structure of time is honored again, where the laws are written on the hearts of the righteous, and where peace fills the earth. This is not presented as a dream or a symbolic idea. Jubilees describes it as the natural conclusion of the plan established at the beginning. The same order that shaped creation will shape the final future. The same covenant that guided Abraham will guide the world that comes after the final judgment. Everything that began in the first chapter reaches completion in the last. The book ends with a tone of certainty, not uncertainty. It assures the reader that the covenant has always been protected, that the world has always moved according to a divine structure, and that every generation plays a role in the unfolding story. Jubilees closes by reminding us that the laws of creation, the guidance of the angels, and the covenant given to Abraham are not confined to the past. They remain active, living, and fully connected to the future that is yet to come. If this final chapter made you reflect on how every part of this ancient story connects across time, write in the comments whether you think the covenant described in Jubilees still affects the world today, and subscribe to the channel if you want to continue receiving this content.